The cowboy opened his barn door and froze when he saw 4 sleeping children. The frost had turned the ranch to iron overnight, and the dawn light came up, gray and thin, barely strong enough to push against the windows of Tiberius Holleran's bedroom. He woke before the sun, the way a man does when he's spent 20 years sleeping alone and his body no longer remembers the luxury of rest. He pulled on his wool trousers and his canvas coat, the one with the elk horn buttons his wife had sewn on before the fever took her, and he walked out into the cold with his breath clouding in front of him. He was going to the barn to check on the mare. She was due to foal any day, and in weather like this, a foal could freeze before it drew its second breath. Tib moved across the yard with the careful stride of a man who had learned to respect ice, his boots crunching through the crusted snow. The barn door was loose on its hinges. He'd meant to fix it back in October before the first hard freeze, but October had turned to November and November to December, and a man alone on a ranch finds that some things simply wait. He pulled the door open. The light came in behind him, a long blade of gold cutting through the dark interior, and it fell across the hayloft where the winter feed was stacked. And Tiberius Holleran froze. 4 children lay in the hay. They were curled together like puppies in a den, buried under a coat that was more holes than fabric, sharing a single thin blanket that had slipped off one small shoulder. The oldest was a girl, maybe 12, her face pale and pinched even in sleep, one arm thrown protectively across a boy of perhaps 8. 2 smaller ones, a girl and a boy, from the matching color of their hair, were pressed against her other side, their faces smudged with dirt and dried tears. They were so still that for one terrible moment Tib thought they were dead. Then the girl's breath fogged in the cold air, and he felt his own heart start again. He stood in the doorway with his hand still on the latch, the morning wind cutting through his coat, and he did not know what to do. A man finds many things on the frontier. He finds stray dogs and lost horses and strangers with empty bellies. But 4 children in a barn, sleeping like the dead in December, is not a thing a man knows how to meet. The girl's eyes opened. They were blue eyes, the color of winter ice on a creek, and they fixed on him with a clarity that was older than her face. She did not scream. She did not startle. She simply looked at him, and in that look Tib saw something that stopped his breath more than the cold, the look of a child who had already seen the worst the world could offer, and had decided that surprise was a luxury she could no longer afford. "Sir," she said. Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "We didn't take nothing. We was just cold." The boy beside her stirred. One of the smaller children whimpered and burrowed deeper into the hay. Tib found his voice. It came out rough, unused. "I reckon you was. This barn ain't fit for cattle in weather like this, let alone children." "We'll go," the girl said. She was already sitting up, her movement stiff, with cold and exhaustion, shaking the boy beside her. Zeke, get up. We got to go. Hold on now." Tib stepped inside, letting the door close behind him to keep out the wind. He kept his hands where she could see them, moving slow, the way he'd learned to move around skittish horses. "Nobody's throwing you out, not yet, not until I know what I'm looking at." The girl pulled the smaller children behind her. It was a futile gesture. She was 12 years old and weighed maybe 80 pounds, and she was trying to shield 3 siblings from a grown man with shoulders like a draft horse, but she did it anyway, and something in Tib's chest turned over at the sight of it. "How long you been in here?" he asked. "Since before dark. We walked all day. This was the first place with walls." "Where are you walking from?" She hesitated. The boy, Zeke, rubbed his eyes and looked at Tib with the blank exhaustion of a child who had stopped being afraid because fear required energy he no longer had. "South," Mercy said. 10 miles, maybe. Our mama." She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "Our mama died 3 weeks back. Fever." Tib felt the words land the way hard news always lands, with a weight that has no shape but presses down all the same. He looked at the four of them, really looked, and saw what he had missed in the shock of discovery. Their cheeks were hollow, their lips were cracked and bleeding. The littlest boy's wrists were so thin that the bones showed clear beneath the skin. These were not runaways from a comfortable home. These were survivors of something that had already gone on too long. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mercy Latimer. This is Zeke. The little ones are Hattie and Jude." "Your father?" "Gone west 2 years ago. Silver mines. He never came back." Tib nodded slowly. He had heard this story before, or versions of it. The frontier was full of men who went west and never came back, full of women who buried their husbands and tried to hold the dirt together with their own two hands, full of children who learned too young that the world did not owe them safety. "My name's Tiberius Holleran," he said. "Folks call me Tib. I own this ranch, such as it is. And I'm going to tell you something plain. You four are coming inside my house, and you're going to eat something hot, and we're going to figure out what comes next. But I'm not going to make you. You can walk out into that snow if you've a mind to, though I hope you don't." Mercy looked at him for a long time. The barn was silent except for the wind pressing against the walls and the soft rustle of the hay. Outside, the mare shifted in her stall and blew out a breath. "How do we know you ain't dangerous?" Mercy asked. Tib almost smiled. It was the first sensible thing anyone had said to him in 2 years. "You don't, not yet. That's fair. But I'll tell you this. I've got a pot of beans on the stove that needs eating, and a fire that'll warm you without asking for anything in return. And I reckon a girl who's kept 3 children alive through a Kansas December has already got the sense to tell a good man from a bad one. So you use that sense, Mercy Latimer, and you tell me what you want to do." She looked at her siblings. Zeke was watching her with the absolute trust of a child who had already surrendered every decision to his older sister. Little ones were awake now, Hattie thumb in mouth, Jude shivering in his thin coat. "1 meal," Mercy said. "Then we decide." "Fair enough," Tib said. "1 meal." He picked up Jude because the boy couldn't walk. His legs had gone numb from the cold, and he carried him across the yard with the others, following in a line. Mercy last, her eyes on everything, missing nothing. The house was small, a 2-room cabin built from local limestone, but it was tight against the weather, and the stove was warm. Tib settled Jude on the bench by the fire and began to move. Coffee, cornmeal mush, salt pork cut thin, the last of the winter apples stewed soft. The children ate like they had forgotten what food was, not greedily. There was no greed left in them, only need. They ate in silence, the little ones sharing a bowl, Zeke holding his spoon with both hands like it might disappear. Tib watched Mercy watch them, and he understood that she had not eaten until they had eaten, that she had probably gone without for days so that they could have what little there was. When the bowls were empty, Tib poured coffee, thin and bitter but hot, and he sat across from them with his own cup. The fire crackled. The wind scratched at the door. It was the first time in 2 years that the house had held the sound of children, and the ache of it was so sharp that Tib had to look down at his hands. "My wife and daughter died of the fever," he said. "Winter of 79, been alone here since." Mercy held her cup with both hands, letting the warmth seep in. "I'm sorry. It is what it is." He looked up at her. "Your mama, she have people? Kin?" "She had a cousin in Dakota Territory. She wrote to her once before she got too sick. I don't know if the letter ever got there. I don't know if the cousin's still alive." "So you walked north?" "We walked north. With 3 children. In December." Mercy's chin came up. It was a small gesture, but it held worlds. "I made a promise to my mama. I promised I'd keep them together, no matter what." Tib nodded. He understood promises. He understood the weight of them. The way they could hold a person up and hold a person down, all at once. The morning passed into afternoon. The children warmed. Jude fell asleep. At the table, his head on his arms, and Tib carried him to the bed in the back room, the bed that had been empty since Lenore died. Hattie and Zeke followed, uncertain but too tired to resist, and they curled together under the quilt that Lenore had pieced from her mother's dresses. Mercy stayed in the main room. She would not sleep. She sat by the fire, with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she didn't drink, and she watched the door. "You can rest," Tib said. "I ain't going to harm them." "I know," she said, but she did not sleep. That evening, Tib went out to check on the mare and found that the chicken coop had been raided, a fox maybe or a coyote. 3 hens dead, their necks broken. It was a small loss, the kind that happens on a ranch, but it meant fewer eggs through the winter. He stood in the cold twilight and felt the weight of it. 4 more mouths to feed, 4 more bodies to clothe, and now 3 fewer eggs each week. When he came back inside, Mercy was at the stove. She had found the cornmeal and the lard and was making hoe cakes with the efficiency of a child who had been cooking for a family since she was old enough to stand on a crate. "You don't have to do that," Tib said. "I know," she said, "but I ain't a beggar, and I don't want my siblings thinking we are." She cooked. They ate again, hoe cakes and molasses, the last of the salt, pork. Zeke ate 3. Hattie smiled for the first time, a small, tentative thing. When Tib made a face at her over the table, even Mercy almost smiled, almost. But Jude would not eat unless Mercy told him to. He sat with his hands in his lap, waiting for permission, his eyes on his sister. Tib watched this with a feeling he could not name. "He won't eat unless you say?" Tib asked quietly. Mercy looked at the little boy. "He's been that way since Mama died. He waits for me." "Maybe," Tib said. "He could try eating without being told. Just once." Mercy's jaw tightened. "When he can eat without me telling him," she said, to Zeke, low enough that Jude wouldn't hear. "Then maybe I'll believe this is a safe place, but not before." Tib let it go. He understood that trust was not a switch to be flipped. It was a wall to be taken down, 1 stone at a time. The next morning, Tib woke to find that Mercy had already been up. She had swept the floor, carried in firewood, and was attempting to milk the cow, with hands too small for the task. The cow was patient, but Mercy was struggling. Tib watched from the doorway for a moment, then went to help. "Show me," he said, not taking over, just showing. She learned fast. By the 3rd morning, she had the rhythm of it. By the 4th, she was doing it alone, and the pride in her face was the first crack in the wall she had built around herself. But the 5th morning brought the rider. Tib saw him from the window, a man on a black gelding dressed in a broadcloth coat and a beaver hat, riding with the straight-backed posture of a man who had never done physical labor he couldn't hire someone else to do. Tib felt a coldness in his gut that had nothing to do with the weather. The man reined up at the gate. "You hollerin'?" "I am. My name is Enoch Blackwell. I represent the Kansas Pacific Railroad Land Office." He produced a leather folder from his saddlebag. "I'm looking for 4 children, Latimer children. Their father signed a contract with my company 12 months ago, deeding his homestead to us for right-of-way consideration. He took an advance of $200 and disappeared. The property reverts to us, and the children are squatters. I've come to remove them." Tib set down his fence pliers. "They're children, not squatters. They're on railroad land. The law is clear. Their father died in a mine collapse in Colorado, February of last year. He couldn't have signed anything 12 months ago." Blackwell smiled. It was a thin smile, the kind that never reached the eyes. "The contract is dated March 14th, 1880. Signed and witnessed. Your grief for these children is admirable, Mr. Holleran, but it doesn't change legal fact. I have a deputy riding up from the county seat this afternoon. The children will be taken to the orphanage in Topeka. It's all quite proper." He turned his horse and rode away before Tib could answer, leaving Nothing behind but the dusting of snow his horse had kicked up and the leather folder that sat on the gatepost like a verdict. Tib stood in the cold and felt the old familiar helplessness rising in him. He was a rancher with 60 acres of rocky Kansas soil and a house that needed a new roof. He was not a lawyer. He was not a rich man. He was a man who had already lost one family and did not know if he had the strength to lose another. He went inside. Mercy was standing at the window. She had seen. "They're going to take us," she said. "Not a question." "Not if I can help it," Tib said. "But you can't," she said. "Can you? You're just one man, and they've got papers." Tib didn't answer, because she was right. He was just one man, and the law, for all its promises, rarely sided with children and widows and ranchers, with empty pockets. The deputy arrived at 2 o'clock. His name was Coates, and he was a young man with kind eyes and a badge that looked too heavy for his coat. He stood in Tib's yard and read the papers Blackwell had left, and his face grew troubled. "I'm sorry, Mr. Holleran," he said. "The papers look proper. I don't have a choice." Mercy stood in the doorway with Jude in her arms and Zeke and Hattie behind her. She did not cry. She simply held her brother tighter and lifted her chin. "Can we get our things?" she asked. "You don't have things," Coates said, softer now. "I'm sorry, miss, but the wagon's waiting." Tib watched them walk out, Mercy in the lead, the little ones following. Zeke looking back once with eyes that were too old for his face. He watched them climb into the wagon. He watched Coates pick up the reins. And then Tib looked down at the folder he still held in his hands. He had read the contract a dozen times that morning. He had read it until the words blurred. And now, watching the wagon start to move, he read it one more time. The date, March 14th, 1880, and beneath it, in small print, the place of signing Creed, Colorado. Tib's hands stilled. He knew Creed. He had a letter in his desk from his brother-in-law, written from Creed, dated February 3rd, 1880. The letter spoke of a cave-in at the Amethyst Mine. It named the dead. Josiah Latimer was among them. A dead man could not sign a contract in Creed on March 14th. "Wait!" Tib called out. The wagon stopped. Coates turned. Tib walked to the wagon with the contract in one hand and the letter in the other. He showed them to Coates. He showed them to Mercy. And then he mounted his horse and said, "We're going to town, all of us, and we're going to see Judge Pym." They rode in a strange procession, Tib on his roan, the wagon behind, with Coates driving, and the children huddled under a blanket. The town of Dry Creek was 3 miles north, and they covered the distance in silence, the only sound the creak of wheels in the wind. Judge Aldous Pym was in his chambers. He was an old man, half blind, but sharp as a tack. He read the letter. He read the contract. He looked at Blackwell, who had arrived with a face like thunder. He looked at the small crowd that had gathered in the hallway, Mrs. Corrigan from the dry goods store, the blacksmith, the minister's wife. "Mr. Blackwell," the judge said, "did you witness this signature?" "I have witnesses." "I asked if you witnessed it." Blackwell's jaw tightened. "The witnesses are employees of the company. They're traveling. Unavailable." "I see." The judge set down the papers. "Mr. Holleran, you have standing in this matter. How?" Tib had not expected the question. He stood in the cramped office with his hat in his hands and felt the weight of every eye in the room. "I don't," he said. "Not legal standing. I'm just a man with an empty house, and a promise I made to a girl to keep her family together. But I know a fraud when I see one, Your Honor. And I know that if you let this man take those children today, you'll be signing a wrong you can't ever unsign." The judge was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up the contract, and he picked up the letter, and he held them together like two sides of a scale. "Mr. Blackwell," he said, "I'm going to hold this contract pending verification of the witnesses. In the meantime, the children will remain in Mr. Holleran's care. If your witnesses appear and testify under oath that they saw a Dead man sign his name, I'll reconsider. Until then, you may consider yourself fortunate that I'm not forwarding this to the territorial attorney on suspicion of forgery." Blackwell's face went red, then white. He opened his mouth to speak, and the judge raised one finger. "One more word, Mr. Blackwell, and I will hold you in contempt. Good day." The crowd in the hallway had grown. 20 people, maybe more, stood in the cold to watch Blackwell emerge from the courthouse with his folder under his arm and his face set like stone. He mounted his horse and rode south without looking back. Mrs. Corrigan stepped forward. She was a small woman with iron gray hair and hands that had folded 1,000 bolts of cloth. "Mr. Holleran," she said, "those children need clothes, proper clothes. You bring them by my store." "Tomorrow. I'll fit them." The blacksmith nodded. "My wife's got extra blankets. I'll bring them by." The minister's wife took Tib's hand. "We'll make it right," she said. "The town. We'll make it right." Tib rode home in the dark, the stars sharp and bright above him. The children were asleep when he arrived, but Mercy was awake, sitting by the fire, waiting. "What happened?" she asked. Tib sat across from her. He was tired in a way that went past bone, past blood, into some deeper place that only began to ache when hope returned. "He ain't taking you," Tib said. "Not today, not ever, if I have anything to say about it." Mercy looked at him with those winter ice eyes, and for the first time since he'd found her in the barn, they softened. Not much, just a fraction, but it was enough. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing this?" Tib thought about Lenore. He thought about the little girl who would have been 4 now, who would have been running through this house with ribbons in her hair. He thought about the silence that had lived here for 2 years and how it had broken this morning when 4 strangers slept in his barn. "Because," he said, "a house with children in it is a better house than one without. And because you kept your promise to your mama, Mercy Latimer. Seems to me someone ought to help you keep it." She didn't cry. She was past crying the way Tib was past crying, but she reached out and she took his hand and she held it for a moment, and that was more than words could ever say. Spring came late that year, but it came. The foal was born on a morning when the frost still clung to the grass, but the sun had warmth in it again. Gangly colt with legs too long and eyes too big, and the children named him Lucky because Jude said he looked like he was surprised to be alive. The guardianship papers were signed in April. Judge Pym made it official. Tiberius Holleran, guardian of Mercy, Ezekiel, Hattie, and Jude Latimer. The town turned out for the reading, standing room only in the courthouse, and when it was done, Mrs. Corrigan baked a cake and the blacksmith brought cider. And for the first time since anyone could remember, the Holleran ranch rang with laughter. Mercy learned to ride. Zeke learned to mend fence. Hattie helped Lenore's old quilt find new patches, and Jude, small, serious Jude, who had not spoken a word for the first week he was in the house, began to talk. Not much, just observations, delivered with the gravity of a judge. "The rooster's mean. Clouds look like sheep. Tib's got big hands." But the moment Tib would remember came on a Sunday evening in May, when the light was gold and long and the air smelled of turned earth and new grass. He was sitting on the porch with his coffee, watching the sunset, and Jude came out and climbed onto the step beside him. The boy sat for a while, swinging his legs, saying nothing. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of dried apple. He ate it slowly, thoughtfully, without looking at anyone for permission. He chewed, swallowed, and looked up at Tib. "You're staying," Jude said. It wasn't a question. "I'm staying," Tib said. "Good," Jude said, "'cause this is home now." Tib looked out across the ranch, at the fields greening in the spring light, at the barn where he had found them, at the children who had filled his empty house with noise and need and love. He thought about the long road that had brought them here, and the longer road ahead, and he knew that whatever came, they would face it together. The sun went down, the stars came out, and in the house behind him, family sat down to supper, whole and warm, and finally, after all the miles and all the grief home.